Welcome back to KORTX's Empowering Transformative Growth series. In each episode, we'll pull back the curtain and give you an exclusive look at the talented individuals behind KORTX, delving deep into their stories, experiences, and the unique contributions they bring to our team. It's our way of showcasing the brilliant minds that drive our commitment to delivering innovative solutions and ultimately empowering transformative growth for our clients and partners. So without further ado, let's dive into today's conversation with KORTX's Director of Strategy, Corey Rice. Corey, how's it going today?
Going great. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, I know you and I have we have a lot of these one-on-one virtual meetings, but we don't get to record any. So good, bad, or indifferent. Here we go.
All right, let's do it.
Before, Corey, we jump into the life at KORTX, how you got here, what your team looks like, and really your vision in the industry. I would love just to learn a little bit more about you and anything that you care to do outside of the walls of KORTX. So if you don't mind, just share a little bit about your hobbies and your interests. What you'd like to do when you're spending your free time.
Yeah, sure. So most of my free time is spent with my family, with my wife, and I have 3 daughters, age 10, 14, and 18. So they take up the bulk of my time. But in the rare instance where I do have some time to myself, been a musician since high school. So I still try and, play guitar as much as possible, which gets less and less every year with all this stuff that comes with having a family, and really enjoy going to concerts. That's something that my wife Niku and I still do on a pretty regular basis. I'm also a huge stand-up comedy fan, always have been. Kind of delved into it myself for a little while before COVID kind of ruined all that, but still like to see comedy shows as much as possible. And I've always loved reading too, so I do a lot of reading in my free time, which again isn't that much, but when I can, like to hit up the library and grab a few books.
Still play guitar? Did you or do you still play other instruments?
Yeah, guitar is my main instrument, but I'm lucky in our basement we have kind of like a full band setup. So we got a drum kit, my guitar, some keyboards and things like that. So me and the kids will go down there and kind of bang around on the instruments and stuff like that. So it's a good way to let out some steam too if you need to bang away on the drums for a couple minutes.
You might be the modern day Partridge Family. Have you ever considered that ago? Get everybody in a van, start touring the country?
I always tell my kids as a joke, I'm like, you're going to have to form a band and support me in my retirement. And so we'll see how that works out.
And I got one last question on the musical side. I know you've kind of been all over and you like a lot of different genres and backgrounds, but who is your favorite musician to see live?
Oh, that's a tough one. I'd have to say the best concert I've ever been to is probably Radiohead. Been a fan of them, since the 90s and always really loved them and never got to see them. And then finally did a couple of years ago. And, after 25 years of waiting, it was pretty high expectations and it exceeded them. So that was pretty awesome.
And you also, I know in the office lately, it's great to see more and more people back. I think we had a little bit of a Spotify DJ series going on. I know you're taking your pass at that. Anything that's on your playlist that you are like must listen to these days?
Yeah, there's this band I've been really into lately, and it's going to sound like they're a fake band, but they're King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard is what they're called. And they play all sorts of different genres. I actually took over Spotify the other day and put them on and realized I'd put on like a 17-minute song. So maybe I shouldn't take it over for quite that long. But it's nice to hear, what everybody likes to listen to and throw something on in the office every now and then.
Definitely mixed genres in the office. I think we go from classicals to jam bands to hip hop to hard rock. Yep. It's all over the place. One of the more active Slack channels too at KORTX, I think, is the music channel.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's switch gears a little bit. Let's move over to your career. How did you get into digital marketing? How did it evolve? Maybe talk about some of your stops along the way and any significant learnings before you made it over to KORTX.
Yeah, sure. So I didn't plan on it at all, actually. It's kind of serendipitous how it worked out. So I got my degree in journalism at Western and then moved out to Northern California to try and start a band with some buddies of mine. And it didn't work out quite as we had anticipated, but had some fun there. But then my wife and I had our first baby out in San Francisco and needed health insurance and everything that comes along with that. And I had a close family friend that worked in San Francisco at an agency called Optimedia. And so he said, hey, are you interested in being an assistant media planner? And I said, what's that? And so we talked through it. This was in 2005 and it sounded interesting. And so I got my first job in the industry at Optimedia in San Francisco and worked as a digital media planner on the Hewlett Packard account. So back then they were one of the first brands that really embraced digital media. It was pretty early days back then. So I got to learn kind of the fundamentals of digital planning. That's back when it was pretty much just publishers and portals and, very different landscape than it is nowadays. And then when I moved back to Detroit, I started working on the GM account at Starcom here. And that's when things really kind of started to shift and new emerging technology started to come out. And that was something I really gravitated towards. And as I realized that I liked being on the cutting edge of technology because it's always changing in our industry. So that was kind of the thing that got me to realize that, hey, I don't have to be doing the same thing all the time. I can be seeking out, these new opportunities and testing new things and learning, and something I've always really enjoyed about the industry.
When you think of your fundamental skills, those that you developed back, starting your career 2005, what are those skills that you learned maybe in your first couple of years that have transferred or carried along with you, even in how you practice today and how you coach and build your teams?
Yeah. So for me, one thing I learned early on is, always be learning, always be asking questions, don't be afraid to raise your hand and say, I'm interested in trying out this new thing. That actually is what led to one of the first interesting opportunities in my career when I was at the GM agency. A company called Right Media came in to present to us, and they were actually one of the first DSPs that was ever created. And so they eventually they invented RTB technology. And since we were General Motors, we got first look at a lot of new tech opportunities. And so, my director at the time said, hey, is anybody interested in taking the lead on this? And nobody raised their hand. So I did, and off we went with, checking out this new technology called RTB buying. And it led to some really unique opportunities. We were one of the first teams to buy on the ad exchange, which was pretty cool. So you're kind of right at the cusp of the emergence of all this new technology. So for me, it's just, always be learning, always be asking questions, and don't be afraid to take risks.
You're very professorial, which we'll get into that, I think, here a little bit later in our conversation, maybe as to why. When you think about the ecosystem today, specifically RTB and real-time bidding, what was a concept that was new back then, something that is still so influential and a foundation of how we operate with many of our customers? What do you think, because the industry has changed so much, in your eyes, what are still those foundational pillars that companies like KORTX must have to offer their customers to be successful? And maybe some of those things, those new ideas that you guys continue to explore from a planning and strategy perspective, how do you balance the two of the old and the new?
Yeah, that's a great question. To me, it all comes down to, not being apprehensive about testing and learning, right? You always need to be willing to, try new opportunities and technologies to understand what's going to be the best fit for your brand, for your agency, whatever it might be. Because if you're not trying anything new, then your competitors are always going to have an advantage over you. And so, we were lucky enough to have clients that were advantageous enough to say, yes, we're willing to try this, but we also have to have an objective, right? You have to know what you're going in to test and learn and what defines success versus what doesn't define success. I think it's equally as important to understand what doesn't work for your brand, right? Versus what does work, so that you can plan accordingly and then apply those to future situations. And so, in that particular instance, it was a complete unknown, this new thing called an ad exchange, and, not buying on a fixed price and in the bidding and all that technology. And if we didn't have, a supporting team and a client that was willing to do that, it would have passed us by, and maybe Ford or Chrysler or one of our direct competitors would have taken advantage of it.
Let's pull it aside for a second. You're really great at taking complex topics and subjects and simplifying them. What does real-time bidding mean to you?
Real-time bidding for me means being able to identify the inventory based on your target audience and where they reside on the open web, and being able to do the most efficient buying process to reach your target audience. And being able to do it in real time is a major game changer, because prior to that, you were buying on web portals like Yahoo and AOL, kind of hoping your audience was there, versus being able to go to directly where they are in real time and be able to put an ad in front of them at the most efficient price possible.
And you've shown some great graphics at KORTX, and I think there's been some blog pieces that have gone out about the intricacies of programmatic advertising and marketers' desire at times to add different layers onto a buy. That could be audience, it could be geography, could be the different KPIs that they want associated with it. So we've just talked a little bit about RTB. When you get a customer in place, or you have someone that we're working with that has all these preconceived notions possibly on how they want to filter and run a campaign, what is your guidance to them? How do you set expectations that may not be the best fit for the program?
Yeah, I think primarily it's about prioritization, right? I know that clients, they want to be able to do everything all at once, and they have all these requirements and expectations and boxes that they have to check. But ultimately, the more layers that you put on, whether it's a campaign or a strategy, the more restrictive that you're getting. And I think sometimes you can get over restrictive, which actually becomes a hindrance to the campaign. And like you said, that can be audience targeting and geo-targeting and exclusion lists and inclusion lists. So if we can collaborate with clients to help them understand what their priorities are from a brand perspective, then you can start to understand what the give and take is there, right? Because if you put too many layers on, you're not going to achieve what you're trying to set out to do, because the box you're playing in is just too small. And when you think about the open internet, I think the inclination is to say, well, we want to do it all and we want to check all these boxes, but it's just not realistic to do that if you ultimately want to have, success and achieve your goals.
Can you talk a little bit about just the process that you've developed over the years, and when you get a customer brief that comes in, just talk a little bit about what the team does at KORTX through that media planning process, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So the first thing that we look at is what's the objective and the KPI, and then we work backwards from there. Because I think a lot of clients even might not be entirely clear on what they're trying to achieve. One example that we see a lot is, let's say the campaign objective is awareness, right? Which is a very broad term that can mean a lot of different things, right? Does that mean you're trying to drive site traffic? Does it mean that you're trying to, increase your brand sentiment? So we start with what's the tangible outcome that we're trying to achieve through the campaign. And then we work backwards from there. What's the audience strategy that we're putting in place? What's the inventory strategy, the creative strategy? Those are kind of the three pillars that we look at. And within each of those pillars, we look for variables that might be counterintuitive to achieving that outcome, right? So for example, they might be trying to drive awareness, but then also say, but we also want an exclusion list that's the entire news category. Well, that's like a fourth of the internet, right? So like if you're removing an entire, inventory category, it could inhibit your ability to drive awareness. So we look for that kind of balance between making sure the client is comfortable with all the variables of the campaign, but also setting themselves up for success.
And I'd like, Corey, I believe that your experience through your career has allowed you to look at those opportunities and look at that process for customers in a bit of a different lens. You talk about starting with a journalism degree from Western Michigan. I know you then went to Starcom. You spent some time at Auto Trader, TubeMogul, True Signal, Samba TV before KORTX. You've been with some major agencies, some emerging and cutting edge technology companies. When it came to the opportunity to join KORTX, what attracted you, and ultimately why did you make the decision?
That's a great question, Chris. There were several things. First of all, I knew someone who worked here, Andy Kemp. Him and I had worked together for essentially our entire career, and I knew that if he had gone to KORTX, then there was a lot of credibility there because him and I were very close and had worked together. But I knew that KORTX was an organization that was willing to take risks, right? To put the client first. To be forward thinking and proactive in bringing in new products and solutions, and not just stay with the status quo, right? Like I've worked at a lot of places where they were apprehensive about evolving, right? Or weren't willing to kind of take on a new opportunity because they were worried about failure and things like that. Whereas at KORTX, it was always putting the client first and making sure that we were checking every box possible in order to put them in a position for success. And I think it's also important to not be, apprehensive about, being realistic with a client about something that may not work, right? And being able to have an open conversation and collaborative conversation with them about, here's how you need to structure this for success. The other piece that was very attractive to me is that, KORTX is an organization that had developed its own technology. We have an engineering team on staff, which was very unique, for a company like us. And I just saw it as a company that was well positioned for the fast-paced evolution of our industry.
And you came into the company as a seller, right? You spent some time going out, getting some reps, understanding what it feels like to get in front of a customer, to pitch the KORTX story, and ultimately have that, why are you different? What's the story around what you guys do different or unique? How do you think those experiences where you're out on your own, you're hunting opportunities, you're in a spot where you're trying to convey our value prop and understand ultimately what's the best fit for the customer, how did that experience shape the way that you approach the strategy component at KORTX and also the way that you lead our strategy team?
Yeah, I spent about 8 or 9 years in a sales capacity, but I always kind of had one foot in strategy because I always gravitated towards that. Because if you can have an influence on the strategy, you're going to be a more successful salesperson because you're bringing programs to the client that are going to work for them. When I made the transition at KORTX, I saw an opportunity to really go all in on strategy to support what was already a strong sales team and help enhance the products and services that we were bringing, to our clients. And I realized that the strategy component was something that really was just more fulfilling for myself from a career perspective. But I also enjoy retaining a sales component in the sense that I love interacting with clients. I love being on calls and explaining strategy and collaborating and all that without having it be 100% of a sales, I guess, kind of approach to it, So like for me, my favorite aspect of the role is, being able to bring my strategy expertise, but still interacting with the client, getting their point of view and really trying to understand what their challenges and objectives are. And then coming back to my team and collaborating with them and how to bring something forward.
Corey, you've been instrumental at being the voice of the customer in a lot of ways and bringing back their feedback and thinking about what the competitive market looks like. But more importantly, understanding the type of situation that those agencies and brands are in. What type of resources do they currently have? What is their internal bandwidth? What are their priorities as a business and an organization? And for me, there's nothing more valuable than having somebody who can sit in the customer's seat. And I know you did that in your past career, being in an agency role, being in a lot of different tech spots, but you're also someone who is very empathetic to a customer's needs, and you can sit there and you can understand the challenges that they have. So there's something very, very special, I think, that you've learned at KORTX, that you have taken sales skills, you've taken empathy from being on the customer side, but also looking at like, where does this best fit sit for products and solutions that we're developing based on what you're hearing. So when you think about when you joined the company in 2019, Axon was probably the largest product that we were talking to our customers about as a lightweight customer data platform. Since then, I know you've been influential working with ops, developing KORTX Intelligence from your own research component, as well as the way that we build out our customer service portal. What is your perspective on the evolution of technology and the role that it plays with our customer services engagements?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple aspects to it. When we talk about customer service and support and the way that we work with clients, to me, it's about the individual needs of each client, which is not a one size fits all kind of approach to it. And I think our ability to craft a customized support for each client, which is a challenge because we work across all industry verticals, right? A lot of different brands and agencies, which means that we do have to approach each one individually. And so I think being able to look at, the products and services that we've developed and the concept of KORTX Intelligence, which is custom insights, research, data points that really bring more, it illuminates what the client is trying to do much more clearly. I've never heard a client say, I'd like to try and do this with less data, right? But then you also need to understand how to analyze that data and make it actionable. I always like to say there's interesting data and there's actionable data. And so if you can kind of find a good balance between both of those, you're only going to do a better service for yourselves and for the clients. And that was kind of the genesis of KORTX Intelligence, is how can we complement the data that the clients are bringing to us and make it more, I guess, more actionable with things that we can learn and ascertain about what they're trying to do, and then bring it back to them and present it in a way that makes them understand what we're trying to accomplish.
As part of your personal mission, I know you're really big on, as you just said, giving customers the ability to be successful. And I know an element of that has always been education. There's so many moving pieces in our industry. There's a lot of noise. There's new trends. There's new technology. How do you help simplify the ecosystem for your customers, for KORTX employees, for your team members? How do you take something that is so complex at times and can be really, really noisy and just simplify it and help them prioritize where their focus should be?
Yeah, I think you have to break it down to its smallest components. I think in our industry, there's almost like this inherent kind of need to make things sound more complex than they are, right? To maybe make people think that you're more sophisticated or whatever it is. And we definitely do work in a complex industry. But at the end of the day, you can break it down to its simplest components, and then you can understand which of those components are most important to the clients. And I think a lot of people probably substitute complexity for the ability to actually get something done, right? Like you overcomplicate things to make it seem like you're offering something really great, or that you're, have some new technology. With programmatic, a lot of us all have the same tools. We have the same inventory, we have the same data, we have the same, but it's how you use those things and incorporate it into your own products and services that are the differentiating factors. So whenever I see someone who's trying to purposely be over complex, kind of pause for a minute and think like, well, what's the reason for this? And does it really need to be that complex? Because if you can take that complexity and make it more simple, I think it just means that you understand it on a deeper level.
The situations I think that many get into when you're playing industry jargon, you're just looking for the keywords. You can fill out a bingo card, or have a game out of it. Many of us have been in that spot, and yeah, I think you're spot on there. Is just get to the bottom of the problem and make sure that it isn't something more complex. We talk about it like we're serving pixels across the internet. These are digital rectangles that we're putting in front of people. So when you can simplify it back to that, it's less of a crisis mode in certain situations.
Yeah. I think a lot of people use complexity as a substitute for actual like industry intelligence and capabilities, right? If you can throw a bunch of jargon on a slide and then hope that someone sees a couple of buzzwords and thinks, oh, well, they must be, sophisticated, when in reality, they probably aren't as sophisticated as it seems.
I had a conversation with Brandon as well, and we were talking about giving advice to someone who is new to ad ops, and how do you get someone to start thinking about the industry? And his point is AdTech, it's technology. It's a infrastructure. It's a tool that allows us to simply, as you said, marketers interact with consumers. And there's a set of tools that sit in between that. His guidance was like anybody new in the industry, still focus on just principles of marketing, price, place, product, promotion. If you can understand the principles of marketing, all the tools that kind of fit into it, that's the intricacies of it, and you'll learn that over time. But you get the idea of what is a brand, what is a marketer, what are the goals and objectives that they have, and then what are they responsible for achieving with their ad spend or their marketing spend. Helps really simplify something that can be very, very, very complex.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of, I kind of realized, pretty early on in my career, even when I was on the agency side and then shifting to other areas, is that ultimately, every brand, every agency, every team has some sort of challenge that they're trying to solve, right? Like you never talk to a client who says, we got it all figured out, we're all set, we're 100% efficient, no, don't need anything here, right? So if you can kind of operate under that approach of, everyone has a challenge, everybody has an objective, you can start there and work backwards and figure out what the best way is to help them achieve those.
I'm going to get you out of here. I got a couple of questions left for you, Corey. One would be looking at your life, you have been, I think this is one of my favorite trick questions. We go into a room, we ask somebody a little bit of trivia. Corey Rice has held multiple career occupations. Which one of these was, an actual role that he held? And I get to say professor, musician, and stand-up comedian. And someone usually shouts out stand-up comedian. He did that once. Like, surprise. He's been all three. So I look at you today and I look at the way you interact with our team and our customers. And there's a lot of things to me that just embody our values at KORTX. So whether that be doing the right thing, communicating with purpose, you have this intrinsic ability to make people just feel like they're heard. And I feel like that's your professorial side that comes out. You can also get a laugh out of any room that I've seen, and you sometimes do it in a very like dry humor type of way, or you're a little more excitable with a comment you might drop. And then the other one, just being a musician, I think that's just your personality. You can be very structured, and I think that probably from practicing and that discipline over the years, but at times I know we get into some spots where we got to solve a problem right now for our customer. We got to jump on the phone with somebody and get it done. That's a pretty awesome combination of skills and traits over the years. So aside from just your job at KORTX, you think about what you've been able to accomplish through your life. Like, what does it mean to have so many different skill sets, and how do you like tie those together to be the person that you are every day?
Yeah, it's funny the way that, I hadn't planned on any of those happening. I was just kind of following my hobbies and my interests, and that's kind of the way that it worked out. But, looking back on it after many years, there's a handful of things, like being a teacher. I taught middle school for several years. That made me feel, empathetic towards other people, right? You're in front of a group of 30 people with all varying personalities and levels of understanding, and you got to kind of find that middle ground. I think that's a lot like, being in a meeting, right? Like you have a lot of people with different backgrounds and understandings and motivations. And, I kind of pulled that from being a teacher and a professor. On the musician and the comedy side, I'd say it's a combination of really just being comfortable in front of a crowd, being able to think on your feet, being comfortable, speaking and adjusting. I mean, I think if I remember correctly, I think public speaking is like the number one, phobia that people have. And, I love it. I can do it all day just because I've done it in the past, but it's just getting reps, you know what I mean? And like being able to read a room and read an audience. I think we've all been in meetings, right, where someone's just talking and they're not paying attention to you and they're just in their own head. And, I really make an effort to try and read the room and understand how people are thinking and responding and acting, and then adjust myself in that way, which hopefully makes communication a lot more effective, and if you can make someone laugh and bring a little bit of levity to it, just reminds us that we're all human. We're all just people trying to do our jobs the best that we can and go home at the end of the day and get up and do it again the next day. So, I try not to take myself too seriously, but I know that there's times where it's important to be serious and professional. And so I try and, balance those two things as much as I can.
That's a great perspective. And I think it's a great illustration of how we all try to operate here at KORTX. It's something where we are very serious in achieving outcomes for either our employees or our customers at times, or if it's a situation to be a little lighthearted and go play a game of kickball or, hang out in the kitchen, have a couple beers, that there's an appropriate time for that as well.
Yeah, exactly. I know we always say, Chris, it's like, I take my job extremely seriously, but at the end of the day, we're not heart surgeons, right? Like we're placing advertising and we're doing the best that we can and working with clients and collaborating and all that. So I think it's just, remembering the human side of things that, we're all just trying to accomplish and do the best that we can.
We're extremely appreciative for the opportunities we have. And we're also very grateful for those that have far more difficult and impactful jobs and careers than we do. So thank you to all the surgeons out there.
Yeah.
We'll get you out of here on this. We talk about our vision and really focus on empowering transformative growth for our employees, for our customers, stakeholders, and the community that we operate in. What does empowering transformative growth mean to you?
For me, it means a couple of things. It means being willing to take risks. It means learning from things you've done correctly and done incorrectly. It means leveraging the right tool for the right job. And then also having a goal on your journey, right? Like knowing where you're trying to get to. And if you can combine all of those things, then you are transformatively growing, right? Because I think it's very easy to become stagnant in our industry and just rely on the same thing that's kind of working, but you're not really going anywhere. You're not, succeeding or not succeeding, but you're just kind of flat. And eventually your competitors are going to lap you if you're approaching it that way. So I think as long as you can kind of keep an eye on the future and learn from the past and use the correct tools, you're in the right path.
That's great. Thank you for joining us for another enlightening conversation in our Empowering Transformative Growth series. We hope you've gained valuable insights and a deeper understanding of what makes KORTX a unique and vibrant place to work and grow. If you enjoyed this episode, check out the rest of the series to hear more inspiring stories from our team. Until next time, take care and continuing empowering transformative growth in all you do. Thanks, Corey.
Thank you, Chris.